Well, good evening, everybody. This is a webinar sponsored by the ASQ Innovation Division. My name is Jose Valdivia, and I'm going to be your facilitator host today. Today we have a pretty impressive presentation delivered by Mr. John Timmerman. And the topic of this webinar is Innovation 2.0. Framework to Fostering Innovation. The learning objectives set by the presenter are: understand the imperative for speed and agility in the competitive landscape, learn the guiding principles to successfully foster a culture of innovation, and define the framework and methods for implementing and managing innovation. This webinar was extended to the ASQ Statistics Division, so we welcome any member of that division as well. Let me give you a quick some information about our presenter. John Timmerman, Ph.D., is a Gallup Chief Scientist, Customer Experience and Innovation. He's a renowned expert in creating outstanding customer experiences while architecting organizational culture, business systems, operational processes, and facility design. He's a recognized thought leader in the science of service. John has presented hundreds of lectures and has consulted on designing customer-centric organizations across a diverse range of industries. Prior to joining Gallup, John served as a Vice President of Operations and Quality for the Ritz-Carlton Hotel Company, and most recently served as the Global Vice President of Guest Experience and Room Operations for Marriott's portfolio of 18 brands and more than 3,700 hotels worldwide. John is a former quality advisor for the Cleveland Clinic Foundation and served with the design and advisory group that created the Service Breakthrough Series, an initiative sponsored by the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. John is the former chairman of the American Society for Quality, which is this organization that is sponsoring this event. And ASQ serves more than 70,000 quality professionals in 140 countries. In May 2015, U.S. Secretary of Commerce Penny Pritzker appointed John to the judge panel for the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. He became a Baldrige examiner in 2005 and served as a senior examiner in 2007 and 2008. John enjoys developing new leaders by teaching research methods and statistics for the graduate program in Service Innovation and Leadership at the Rochester Institute of Technology. John received his bachelor's degree in hotel, restaurant, and institutional management with honors from the University of Delaware, and his master's degree in Service, Leadership, and Innovation from the Rochester Institute of Technology. He completed his doctorate in hospitality management at Iowa State University. Prior to starting his career in the hospitality industry, John served in the U.S. Marine Corps as a second force recognized Marine. Well, John, thank you for giving your time and share your experience and learnings in this such an important topic of innovation. And well, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you to handle the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for the very kind introduction, Jose. First, thank you everyone for your time that you're spending with us here on the webinar. And then more importantly, thank you for your contributions to ASQ. ASQ back in the early 90s for me was instrumental foundation for the development of my capabilities as a manager and supported my success and career endeavors, as I trust it's helping to support you as well. I recall about 5 years ago when the Innovation Division was an idea, and it's just really fabulous how it's come to life to a thriving division with ASQ, with many, many impacts I can see that it's going to make over the course of ASQ's future history. The title of this presentation, Innovation 2.0, it's essentially, though, just my lessons learned that I'm sharing with you. No better thing that I can do is to share the things that I've learned, successes, but equally important, those things that were opportunities, growths for me in terms of things that I've tried, I've learned. It's, there's the mantra within innovation, fail fast, and I'll try my very best to be able to impart that to you over the time that we have here on the webinar. Here's the good news. Well, here's the bad news. It's probably at the end of your day for many of you, unless you're dialing in from the West Coast or international. But the good news on this, I've just really laid it out to about less than a dozen slides to kind of share some high-level learnings across my journey. The first one is how you define innovation. I mean, this is an ongoing question just across not only ASQ, but innovators, across multiple industries, functions, and roles. And I like to use a Duran trilogy. It's clear to separate and differentiate innovation from control, quality control, being able to manage variation through various methods and statistical tools. Where it gets a little bit blurry, though, is when you look at the zone of improvement as it relates to a higher level of achievement and performance levels of innovation. So there's two things that I look at when I try to really assess, is this innovative? One is, what is the overall rate of improvement? Are we hitting a hockey puck in terms of key outcomes that we're trying to accomplish? But then I also overlay that with, what's the value proposition change? The results and experience that you're creating is part of the consumer or a business, commercial, or even an internal outcome that's being designed in relationship to the price and the access. And this is really important. There's a lot of good case studies that we could spend quite a bit of time talking about. One of my favorite examples, some of you may be familiar with it, is Blockbuster. Blockbuster was focused on delivering media entertainment through its brick and mortar stores. Its results were improving year over year in terms of revenue. They had great, outstanding outcomes around how they were improving the overall consumer experience. They were dialing up customer service, the emotional engagement between the people that were registering you with your videos or your video games as you were renting them or purchasing them in the stores. And their price points were fairly stabilized year over year, but where they were really disrupted was on the overall access of the value proposition. And many of us are familiar with what set them sideways, and it was other media venues such as Netflix that were very disruptive to them. And so when I look at innovation, I go back to the prior slide, what's the overall rate of improvement? But then to this slide right here, how does it overlay with the value proposition and how that's been modified, it's been radicalized. And the innovations don't necessarily, in many cases, come from within industry pollination. If you really study innovation and you take it even back to the cigar bars of the turn of the century, it was being able to harvest ideas from adjacent industries or cross-pollination from diverse industries that really sparked the ideation to help disrupt that value proposition. So when I work with clients around the world, probably about 70% of my time is in markets like Asia and the Middle East, and the remaining balance in the U.S. These markets are really trying to differentiate themselves within the consumer's eyesight. And when you look at trying to differentiate on price, when you do that, then you become essentially a commodity because you're at parity and you're trading a commodity across the exchange. If it's results, just because of the function of how technology, both technology in terms of not just digital but information flows, has really accelerated design and development processes. And so an innovation of yesterday is easily replicated tomorrow in terms of consumer products. So results becomes more of a challenge like price. And then experience and access seems to be the two domains that are the ones that are really going to be able to separate a company in terms of how it radicalizes its value proposition. And if you look back in terms of, the differentiated products and services against a value proposition, you essentially had in the distribution curve, on one side of the curve, those organizations that were creating extreme niche markets. So these were high-end niche products and services. It could be luxury, serving Uber customers of high wealth. And then you had kind of the mass distribution of that center point around providing some level of customization. So you could buy your Ford truck, but you could pick out the types of product features such as the leather color, the body color, the type of V6 or V8 engine that you want to put in it, and so on and so forth. And what I see is that radically changing. That customization is going to be fall to more of the left side of the curve, and you're going to see more of the niche, what I would call, and what great innovator Prahalad would call, the N=1 type of innovation start to sweep across that curve. And not just the integration of the consumer preferences in terms of how they want it personalized, but the integration also of the various suppliers and service delivery mechanisms. So, the best example that I have on this is you can go online, and I'm not going to promote any particular vendors or organizations on this call, but you can go online and you can pick out a customized makeup for your hair color, for the stylization of your persona, of your facial features. But that's not what's incredible. What's really a breakthrough around this is not the personalization of that particular makeup, but being able to assemble that makeup using an array of multiple vendors and that overall service delivery process. So it's the value proposition of delivering something where it's personalized at N=1, but through what would be called R=G, through global resources. And that radically changes the dynamics around the access to these products and services and really how they're dialed in to the specific needs of customers' wants, expectations. So the best, for me, definition of innovation is how dramatic is the change in performance levels, the first slide we looked at, and then overlaid with how does it disrupt the value proposition within the market, and not just against the external market, the consumer, for many quality and innovative professionals that are part of ASQ. The products and services are in a support function. So if you work in the back office, how do you radically change the value proposition and we deliver to the frontline services that ultimately enable them to deliver to the customer, whether that's a B2C customer scenario or a business-to-business B2B. Now, there's another question around innovation. Is there an innovation best practice? And this makes me think of one of my favorite movies, Kung Fu Panda. My Kung Fu can beat your Kung Fu, and there's a lot of Kung Fus out there in terms of innovation practices. My observation and conclusion is the Kung Fu is less important than the discipline by which it's performed. I'll just give you a personal example. I had studied over the course of my life martial arts, and I always look for what is the very best techniques. And then I had the benefit of having a martial arts instructor while I was stationed in the Marine Corps in North Carolina. And he spent, in some of the matches I would win and some I would lose, and it would be kind of 50-50. And I started winning with this particular instructor, and it was kind of like the Karate Kid scenario, because even though I had a black belt credential, he spent the first 6 months perfecting one punch, one technique, so that it became very powerful within my arsenal. And that's in similar respects to innovation practices. There's an array of practices, but it requires a degree of diligent application to really become proficient in it. So it's not enough to know Six Sigma or any of the other techniques. It's much more important to be able to understand with a level of discipline how they're applied, and so that you can adjust that discipline or that punch in this analogy that I'm giving you to different situations in a very effective way. Now, if you think about innovation and how it's evolved over time, it started with experiments, test cycles, evaluating the outcomes going back several hundred years. Then it migrated with a short cycle, the PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act, or PDSA sometimes it's referred to, back in the early 30s. Then NASA formalized this as they wanted a much more regimented process to solution innovation design, and developed the stage gate process, and the quality function deployment was built upon that so that the requirements of the design were aligned and translated into design specifications. Then we saw in the early 80s Six Sigma, companies that were very famous for their applications, General Electric and Motorola. And the last count that I did, which was probably about, it's somewhat dated, 7 years ago, I counted over 36 different variations of Six Sigma, or 36 variations of what I would call Kung Fu. And the variation of Kung Fu, in my opinion, is less important than the fundamental understanding of its application and the diligence by which you follow that application. Now, with that being said, whether you're using DMADV for innovation or design for Six Sigma DFSS, this tends to follow a very linear process, a stage gate flow. We define it, we measure it, we develop the specifications, we test them, we verify the outcomes through a learning cycle, and so on and so forth. And this has to also be complemented by what I would call agile innovation. And it's a similar analogy that I would give to software development. In software development, you have what would be classified as waterfall development. For those of you that are in technology software design, you're familiar with this, where it goes through this somewhat of a very similar stage gate process. And then you have agile development, where the design, the testing, the verification are all being done in one continuous cycle to improve the overall speed of learning cycles, the velocity of the design, and the speed to market. Now, this is not a question of what's better, a stage gate linear process or a much more iterative agile design. It's more a question of appropriate application. So when I oversaw designing, for example, very large products that would cut across 4,800 hotels, where we had to scale the design, in many cases the stage gate process was much more appropriate because of the risk of investment and the necessity to have a design that could be extrapolated across a very broad platform of business units, or in this case, in my life, it would have been hotels. With that being said, we also, in a very intentional way, implemented agile designs where we would have our testbed hotels that were continuously developing, trying, creating learning cycles around new different product and service delivery, and those learning cycles were the feeders for the macro stage gate designs. And so these things in many respects can live in harmony. If you're working with, I've done innovation across the world, and if you're working with a small business in Dominican Republic that's selling products, the agile design is probably in many cases a much more appropriate process to create quick learning cycles within a small organizational structure, and whereas when we're looking at higher risk, much more platforming requirements, then the stage gate process tends to be more appropriate. And then there's also the hybrid of incorporating stage gate platform innovation with feeders of agile learning cycles that are helping to inform the new concepts, the new insights and innovation for future big platform stage gate processes. And this is where I think organizations miss it, because it goes back to the my Kung Fu is better than your Kung Fu. They tend to buy in to a set of methods and processes philosophically, and then they deploy that as part of their organizational culture, whether it's an agile or a stage gate or maybe ideally a hybrid, but they don't understand what would be the appropriate situation context for deploying those different methodologies. Now, the early work that I did around innovation, and this is what I developed through some pretty intensive research, is the question, what is the innovation framework? So if multiple methodologies are a consideration, there's no one best kung fu, what are the key success factors for innovation? And in this research that I did, I started with qualitative, where I did interviews with innovation organizations, with organizations like American Express and studying their innovation processes, focus interviews with technology companies like Cisco, and spending a day with John Chambers and understanding how innovation is applied in the context of their business model. And then it was supplemented by a quantitative study. And the results of this research study identified that there's 7 elements to the innovation framework. Now, the first element, which is the phases of the design process, are fairly well understood. What are the translating requirements to specs to concepts? And then where it typically gets missed a little bit, though, is a design for culture. And this goes back to the work of Dr. Duran. It's a cultural transfer process. And even though graphically it's illustrated as a linear flow, the best practice innovation design phases incorporate the design for culture on the front end. So those individuals that are involved with the change management process are on the front end cycle of the design requirements and specifications, so they have clear line of sight of what needs to be transferred to the culture. A lot of what drives decisions, both with consumers as well as employees, is based upon the principles of behavioral economics. At Gallup, our senior scientists, Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner, Angus Dean, Nobel Prize winner, time and time again have demonstrated that many decisions are made based upon non-rational aspects, whether that's if someone's going to internally activate a new innovation design within the organization from an internal market orientation, or whether the consumer is going to accept it and it's going to be materialized in terms of market share. And so it's really important for that design for culture to have a good grounding in behavioral economics. And then on the process side, this is fairly well understood as well in terms of design for Six Sigma methodologies. They grow and they will continue to develop in their variants forms for application. Quality to function deployment is a well-cited way to be able to implement innovation. It's not just an engineering technique, it's a technique to make sure that you're addressing the overall value proposition with the design specifications. Modeling and design tests are also fairly well deployed. And then around analytical tools, design of experiments, even though many would characterize that as a statistical tool or perhaps a control experiment tool, from my research, these have been instrumental in being able to help validate the innovation design. Failure mode effects analysis. I remember when I inherited a team of 40 designers at Marriott, and we designed everything from the new bathrobe that would go in the JW brand to the new guest room for the Courtyard or the Experience when you check in at the Renaissance, and so on and so forth. And one of the most valued innovation tools of my designers was failure mode effects analysis. Being able to really understand within that design structure and architecture what are the key critical points. And then, you know, the TRIZ model, used a lot within clearly product and engineering design, but has a high potential within service design. Some of the biggest breakthroughs I mentioned earlier could come from pollinating and benchmarking to similar industries, and taking a moment to see what design solutions have worked within the engineering frameworks can bring a new level of thought process within the innovation analytical methods. And then there's ideation. the common brainstorming to divergent thinking, 6 hats, incorporating voice of the customer. The one point I would make on brainstorming is I've seen it done quite a bit, but I haven't seen it done in a very effective way that drives a high utility. Many times the brainstorming teams miss key fundamentals of their Kung Fu, of making sure that they've got high diverse members on the team. When I first oversaw operations for Ritz-Carlton and we were getting ready to design our new restaurant, I made one requirement of my VP of Food and Beverage. I said, hey, you own the design process for the new innovative restaurant. The only requirement I have is on your design team when you start to brainstorm new ideas. Typically, you have 7 people on that team, and it's a mix of food and beverage and culinary experts. You still need to have those. I recognize that they're core and essential for technical application, but you have to have on the design team at least 50% of those members that come from diverse functions. I want to see people on the team that come from accounting, from HR, that are going to be able to bring a different lens in how they see the world to stimulate and create some tension within that brainstorming process. And then the area that's typically understated is the business model and the human capital factors of the culture, of how senior leadership reinforces the overall portfolio of innovation, the strategy, the cadence of investment, building capacity for innovation. It's just not enough to say we want to be innovative. We need to have the right technical capabilities. We need to build capacity across different departments and functions in the organization. And then there has to be the motivation. What's the intrinsic driver for this? And this links back to behavioral economics, of what really drives people. And the research points to strong evidence that it's how people connect what they're doing to purpose. So the wonderful thing about working in the field of innovation, it's a really quick path from what you do to a higher purpose, because you're creating something new, exciting, dramatic impact. People like to be builders, whether they're the actual builder or the orchestrator of that building, or whether they're a subject matter expert for that building. It's the IKEA effect. They love it by virtue of being part of building that bed that they built from IKEA, more so than what that bed actually looks like. Of course, it's got to look good, and it's got to be able to monetize in many cases in the market, or provide social impact if it's not a revenue-generating outcome, but it's that intrinsic value that really drives it. And then it's supported across customers, employees, environments, and partners. So if I were to come into your organization and be asked to say, hey, give me an audit on innovation at company XYZ, at Acme Company on 34th Street, these would be the key elements I would look at. I would look at how you're managing across the design phase, the processes, the analytical tools complemented with ideation approaches, how it's supported by the business model, and then the infrastructure and capabilities on the human capital side. And that's, in a very robust way, that's how I would give a report card on the overall health of innovation at an organizational level. Now, part of the research that I did was in collaboration over the years with ASQ. And we did a survey based upon the model I just shared with you, and we asked a question from that model. What are the key factors, the most critical elements of driving organizational innovation? And what's quite dramatic in this is, even though when you go to a Design for Six Sigma workshop, there's a lot of talk about processes and methods and techniques of analysis, and that's a foundation. Don't take it away, it needs to be there. It's critical. So I'm not undervaluing that in any way. However, with that said, when we surveyed 1,486 senior fellows, where this is their core role in an organization, it was not the technique, it was not the style of the Kung Fu that they were using, it was actually the softer side, it was the culture, the attitudes and the participation rates for innovation across teams. Not did we have their hands, their technical expertise at the innovation table, but did we have their minds and, more importantly, their hearts. It was second to that, and a close second. So these are kind of ordinal, but there are distances statistically between these 5 items. A close second was, what is the senior leadership support? How do they promote advocacy and risk-taking? How do they blend short-term financial gains with long-term investments, which many of these platform innovations require? And the third one is capabilities. How are we building innovation, not just in terms of dialogue and the communication, but more importantly, the human technology, the workforce talent, the training, and the expertise, and providing people with the right tools and training and just in time for these innovation cycles, whether it's stage gate or they're much more agile innovation cocktail. And then a very far second in the study was the process, the methods, the tools, and the strategy alignment. There's a clear need in large organizations to have portfolio management for innovation, but the general findings from the study was the clear foundation for success is let's make sure that we can bake it into the culture, we can get leaders to incorporate into the mission, the vision, values, they can behaviorally reinforce it, we can generate over time capabilities, and on capabilities, I think it's a good chapter we can take from the early days of Six Sigma in being able to provide training and support and mentorship through master black belts, for an example, as mechanisms to build those capabilities, which then you can overlay the process and the strategy. Now, when we take a look at key success factors for innovation, back in 2010, at that point in time, I had conducted over 350 innovation projects, some small and some very large. Some of them redesigning the new laundry delivery process. Some of them would be redesigning the overall guest experience from the point of booking the reservation, incorporation of mobile technology to when you digitally check out of the room. Irregardless of the scale or the type of those 350 episodes in innovation, I did a study of what worked and what didn't, what was successful, what were less successful, or what you could just plainly call failures. And then I separated two, and I looked for commonalities between success and failure, compare and contrast. And this is what I found in analysis of 350 projects that I architected and orchestrated over the course of my career. The first one, and I kind of coined vital, all of us researchers and consultants, we like to create acronyms. That's just a function of who we are and what we do. It's just an easy way to impart the knowledge in something that people can quickly understand and be able to connect to in a phrase. But the first element was getting the vision right, considering the broader framing beyond the obvious project goal. And this directly relates to the slide we looked at earlier around value proposition. The very best innovation projects that I had the privilege of supporting really nailed the value proposition. Those that were less successful, they were doing what I would call gold plating. They were adding features and functionality that at a net effect really didn't make a disruptive change in the overall value proposition. And I'll give you an example of this. I was at Ritz-Carlton corporate office, and I received a phone call from one of our owners. And for those of you that may not realize this, Ritz-Carlton as a brand does not own the hotels. We have investors that build the hotels. They invest millions of dollars, in case billions of dollars, in some of our larger assets, and they're looking for a return on investment. It's pure economics for them. And so they're looking at the daily revenues and the monthly P&Ls, and they're looking for their return from their multi-million, or some cases $1 billion investment for a new Ritz-Carlton property. And one of these investors called me. He owned a number of Ritz-Carlton hotels. He built a number of them, and he was just totally upset. And he wanted to talk to me because his properties, which were primarily resort properties, were budgeting for the next fiscal year product feature changes. They were going to put new Bose radios and larger flat panel and new technology in the guest room. And he just, you know, on paper, he didn't feel that it was actually going to materialize into a clear ROI. And just in a brief conversation, I felt that he had a point, because most of the hotels he owned were beach properties, resort locations. And if you're half awake, you understand that the last place you want to go if you're on a resort, destination, luxury, or leisure getaway is a guest room. You want to enjoy the environment, the facilities. You want to fully immerse yourself in that resort destination. And so I called up our innovation team, and we have a leader in each one of the properties that manages innovation. And I said, team, let's do this. Let's step back from the current recommendations for product feature enhancement, which would be an incremental improvement, and you could debate whether it was innovative or not as you compared it against the competitors as a reference point. And let's really look at the value proposition. And what we needed to do, which goes to the second point of insights, we needed to really understand behavioral economically what was going to drive a differentiation on market share and the amount people are willing to pay for that stay to net a good ROI. And our team were trained, and they deployed their technique of what's called ethnography, where they spent a month just studying the behaviors of these resort guests in the hotels. They studied where they went, where they didn't go, what they threw away in the garbage can. That was revealing in terms of do they bring other products into the hotel that we don't provide, new products that they consume at higher versus lower rates. And so there's many learnings for revamping that value proposition, but one of the most significant one was an observation of the guests going down to the pool and the beach areas early in the morning. And if you're on vacation, leisure, you should be sleeping in. You shouldn't be getting up at 8 o'clock, going down with the behavior that we saw. They were putting books, they were putting magazines, in some cases they were putting shirts or some article on a chair in a prime location of the beach or the pool. And they were trying to claim stake to that piece of real estate parcel. That's my chair. So they could go back up and have breakfast and spend time with family and then come down and be assured that no one was going to sit there because there was an identifier that that was someone else's. And if someone else did move it, then they would clearly communicate to them that they had prior stake to that piece of real estate. And that insight really helped us understand that the value proposition in these destinations was in the hotel room, and new Bose radios or any other feature that we can incorporate it. It was being able to provide a new level of experience with a higher economics at the beach and the pool. And essentially, just to come to the end of that story, we created what was called the concierge experience on the beach and pool, where the guests could pre-reserve a prime location at the pool or the beach. We loaded it with additional amenities and features. So if you reserved a concierge area within the pool, we would load that with other items such as bottled water and spritzers and some fruit and so on and so forth. And the repeat purchase rate from that was about 75%. But here was what was really interesting. The overall differentiation between the average rate someone was paying per night, which was about $250, and what they were willing to pay to reserve a concierge experience at the beach or pool was $150, incremental on top of the $250. So the overall cumulative net of that was $400. That's a radical change in value proposition. That's a true indicator and litmus test of innovation that's tied to key insight. And I would say this, a lot of the work that I do is around consumer-based innovation, whether it's with luxury automotive or financial service or hospitality services. 10 out of 10 times, the key insights that we generate for changing that value proposition doesn't come from a market study where we send out a survey. It doesn't come from one person in a closet in the corporate office coming up with some great ideas, although those may be great ideas that are catalysts for the innovation process. 10 out of 10 times, it comes from the diligence and the hard work of really observing the consumer behaviors. Another example that I would give is when we were designing a new spa concept in Asia, which is a very different market, and you can't even say Asia, right? Because, you know, if you just take a country like China, even China has 50 different sub-markets and cultures within it. And then there's micro markets within that and so on and so forth. So there's extreme caution caveat when you categorize consumer segments and even particularly geographic regions. But when we want to understand the value proposition within this Asia market, we want to target the Generation Xers and upcoming millennials. And what we ask a fundamental question: what does a spa deliver? Well, it delivers relaxation. That's the essence. And so then we start to study, where do people go for relaxation? And it wasn't spas within this Asian market. It was these gaming houses that were, some of these places were like 6-story buildings where people would go, relax, it'd be served food and beverage, they would play communal or board games. And the insight there was that people want to have relaxation within a group. Whereas in many cases in North America, the spa experience is an individual experience. In this particular Asia market, it was a communal experience, and that radically changed the insights around how we design the spas. It couldn't be a small lobby. It had to be something that could accommodate a large or multiple groups coming in the spa at the same time. It could not just be one spa room. It had to be spa rooms, if you had 5 or 10 or 15, which would be a large spa, that could be opened up for multiple parties to experience the spa services. And it's just another example of when you do this service retail type innovation, that ethnographic study of consumer behaviors are key to this. And if we had more time, we could go deeper on this. One of the things that I'd ask you to do, if you want to do a little bit of follow-up on this, is take a look at how Lego radically changed its market positioning. They were failing, a Denmark company, and they had to understand why parents weren't buying Lego toys. And it came from the insight of how did the fundamental concept of playing change over multiple generations, and that came through ethnographic insights. So test. I learned something really quick to take out of the innovation term piloting. And the reason for that is because piloting creates a connotation that we created the right design and we're going to implement it, maybe with minor refinements. And that's not true. And I'll give you a practical example. When I got to Marriott, I had one of the innovation projects that I inherited was creating and implementing a new cleaning process. Pretty innovative process, and this is not proprietary information I'm sharing with you. It's a pretty well-known process now, even though at the time it was much more of an unknown and competitive advantage. And the prior process was essentially, if you have 50 housekeepers that clean guest rooms, and this is like really hard work. I've done this work myself. You're cleaning 16 rooms in a period of 30 minutes per room and making sure you got all the right linen there to, stock the room. It's a logistics process, and it's lifting large, heavy mattresses, and just, if you travel in hotels, please make sure you lay $1 and maybe even $5 on the mattress when you leave at the end of your stay, because certainly it's very intensive work that the housekeepers go through to deliver a room that appears like no one else has stayed there, something that's surgically clean. But the typical model was you train all 50 housekeepers to clean the rooms that people stayovers, so I'm going to be there for multiple nights, the same way you clean a room when someone checks out, where someone else, a new guest, is going to come in. So same methodology, same technique, same supply management process. And the innovation was that the expectations, and the insight was expectations for somebody staying over multiple nights were very different than someone checking in for the very first time. Someone checking in for the very first time wants to feel like no one else has ever stayed there. So that's a core design requirement. However, people that have been there multiple nights, there's a level of comfort with the room, and so although it needs to be clean, it doesn't need presented like no one else has stayed there. And in fact, what we found in the insights, it becomes quite irritating to the consumers when you create a room like it was when you first checked in. And just an example would be when I stay over multiple nights, like when I was in Riyadh for 2 months, I have to iron my clothes every morning. And so the last thing I want to do is come back to my room at the end of a long day and see the ironing board packed back in the closet, knowing that I have to take it out, unravel the cord, and get it prepped and ready for the next day. So the insight was training the housekeepers to do stayovers very differently than individuals that are checking in for the very first time, and to identify that there's two different skill sets. There's some housekeepers that are really good at identifying behavioral patterns of people and not putting the iron back in the closet or changing how you arrange stuff in the bathroom, on the countertop, and so forth, from those that the talents of people that could create a surgically clean room, so it felt like no one else has ever stayed there. And so we created this great model based upon consumer insights, and we did 40 pilots of it, and we're getting ready to roll it out to the next wave of 10x 400 hotels. And I was getting feedback that there was problems with acceptance of the new design. And the feedback that I received was, well, it's probably a leadership issue. Well, my question was, how many have we installed so far past the 40 pilots? And it was 186. And so my question was, how many of those 186 are resisting the design? And it was 186 out of 186. And clearly, that's not a leadership issue. That's a cultural/design issue. We can't just, say that the leaders aren't doing their job of aligning the organizations. And so I assembled 2 focus groups from the initial pilots, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast. And I used a technique that proves fairly effective over time with me. I took all of the senior leaders, the general managers that were part of the initial pilot, and they all said, the design works corporate, we love it. This is the best thing since sliced bread. And that's why we went forward with full implementation. Now we're at 186 and the train's coming off the tracks. And after we had a nice dinner and a nice flowing of wine, I asked the general managers, I said, I want to know, first and foremost, why everyone said, not just you, but just everyone collectively said this was a great design, because clearly it's not, because it's not working in another 186 hotels. And there's always one in the group, one person with command and courage that stepped up, and he said, hey, I'll tell you why. Because I didn't want to be the only hotel that told corporate its design didn't work. Like anything that comes from corporate, when you give us the pilots, we do it, we work through it, we develop workarounds, and we move forward. And we kind of figure out internally what's important to corporate, what's going to get a follow-up versus what's not, and we prioritize where we spend our time. And that was a key insight to me to roll out things within the framing of it's a test. We've done a lot of diligence investment to design a really good specification for you. However, we want you to find the flaws in this as part of the first evolution of change. And that dramatically changed the dynamic between the innovators and those that have to ultimately operationalize in the market. And I've seen other great cases after that learning cycle of companies like Amazon that'll ask designers to go out and find the flaws and fix them and create incentives and rewards for that. But the fallacy of is the design perfect has to be addressed on the front end, and the best way to do that is framing it around tests. The other thing is alternatives. If you study great designs, they never come from one design, but from an iteration of multiple designs. And one of the things I've learned in innovation work is I will reject a one horse. I always, by function, want to have, and depends on the situation, 3 to 5 different horses that we're designing in the race and hybriding that. And it's an old dated video, but it's a good example of this. If you YouTube IDEO, I-D-E-O, and I worked with them a lot in innovation design in the work that we did over the course of my career. And when you study their process, they kind of follow what I'm giving you in principles. They get a great insight. They pull together a diverse team, but they also split these teams apart, and they have them create, in the first iteration of prototypes, competing designs for the product or the service that they're designing. And it's not did one team create the better design, it's how can we hybrid and pollinate different elements of design to a much more stronger, more competitive, value proposition changing design. Now, the last part of the vital is learning. And some of you may agree or disagree with this, but my conclusion is that some of the best designers that I've worked with and been exposed to, they're not very good at creating learning cycles. And by that, I mean they're always, if they're driving down the innovation road, they're looking through the windshield at the next new design to create, which is part of who they are, and they need to continue doing that. But they don't naturally look through the rearview mirror and retrospectively analyze what can we learn from past success and failures of previous designs. And I'm a prime example of this. It took me a decade and a half and 350 designs for me to step back and say, let me do a retrospective and let me compare and contrast what's worked and what hasn't, so I can create a learning cycle on this and feed this into future designs. So when I worked with innovators, one of the things that we've designed in, because it's not part of their natural DNA, is a retrospective evaluation process of the design, so that those learning cycles could then be inputs to future design processes and innovations that they're creating. And in many cases, it's my observation that this doesn't come natural. It has to be a process that you implement, a checkpoint within the calendar of work that's being done. The last part that I'm going to leave you with around innovation is the human element, the human technology. Now, and this is not a self-promotion for Gallup. I'm doing this to serve you as innovators. One of the most powerful things you have as your capability, based upon the research that I've done with ASQ and other benchmarks around innovation, is not the technique of innovation, but the human capital that enables the innovation. And the work that was done by Dr. Don Clifton over a period of 40 years, 4 decades, was around positive psychology. What makes people successful at what they do? And from a sample of over 2 million individuals that were the very best at what they do, whether it's in healthcare, the best surgeons, or in education, the best teachers and professors, or in sports, the very best goalies and hockey, and just, it was a very diverse sampling, but very broad and powerful database of 2 million. There were 34 themes that were identified that are recurring in all human beings. And then those themes naturally fall under 4 dimensions. Some individuals have themes that are very strong and related to execution. So on the slide on execution, if you look at focus, and that's kind of self-explanatory. Can you be a jet fighter pilot and push through something? Or another theme of discipline. Can you stay on course to the regiment of what you're doing, or are you easily sidetracked onto the next new thing or next new shiny object? Or responsibility. I consulted at Gallup. His responsibility was his top talent theme. And this guy, Steve, I get emails from him at midnight his time and then 4 a.m. his time. And I could always link it back into responsibility because people were asking for his help, and he felt intrinsically compelled to be able to help them and to deliver what he was responsible for. Timelines were never a gray area with him. It was black or white. I promised it and will always deliver on it. So those are execution themes. Then you have influencing themes of, my top theme, just to share personal, it's command. Do you love, not just enjoy, but do you enjoy taking control of an audience or having courage to say what other people are not willing to say? Do you have a feeling of significance in the work that you do? Do you see competition as a strong driver? In other words, if you're on the highway, do you typically race other people, even though there's no trophy at the end of the highway? Are you racing them just because you feel compelled to be a little bit ahead of them on the road? Those are influencing themes. The next dimension is around relationship building. Can you connect with people in the ecosystem? Do you want to develop people? Do you want to create a sense of harmony, include people in the innovation process? Do you want to relate who everyone is at an individual level to the work that they're doing? Those are relationship building dimensions. And then you have strategic thinking, which is, do you like to learn? So innovators are bringing new ideas, intellectualization. Do you like to just sit there and think about the future? Do you like to ideate new things? Do you like to relate it to the overall strategy and how it's going to move the business forward? Those are strategic thinking themes. And what I found with the very best innovation teams, it wasn't a matter of, do you have a team that's balanced across all of these? It was more of an awareness around, what does the team have as a collective first and foremost? And once they have that awareness, then they can identify how they can shore up some gaps. And an example was, I was working with a client, this was in Asia. They had 200 innovators, and when we did a composite grid of everyone, they were really strong, and they're just natural talents around strategic thinking and relationship building. They create great ideas, and they'd be able to network across the organization to get buy-in to those ideas and to vet them. But when it came to being able to market those ideas around influencing, it was a flat tire. Now, so what do you do with that? Do you hire more influencers, or do you trade out people that are not have influencing team for individuals that do? No. Because in organizations, reality is you have to work with the army you have. You have to, in many cases, as I say, fit and retrofit the ship at sea, real time. And so in this particular situation, what we did is we brought in marketing individuals that had natural influencing themes to complement the existing innovation design team, so that they would supplement who they were as a composite. So it wasn't a matter of, does a team have to have all of these domains? It was more a question of, does a team have a good inventory of their intensities around these domains so that they can navigate and collectively work and reinforce the areas of strength and then backfill those areas of less strength for them. Now, I say that to also bring the point that when I've worked with people that have done innovation, it's important to go from insights to solutions. And when I first came to Gallup, I had the pleasure initially, as I do over the course of my career with Gallup, to work with just the best talent. If you take a look at our organization, for every pre-qualified, freshly minted MBA that has the on-paper requirements to be a consultant, we select about 1 out of 180. So high discrimination in terms of, we want to get the people that have not only the right academic experience, but they have the right intention of what they want to do, purpose in life, and the right fit for the culture, so that all those things align together in a perfect way. So, and we've been doing selection research, and something that we do for clients over the past, numerous 5 decades. And so, but I would work with consultants that when I go on an innovation project, even though they were great consultants, some would do a better job in some areas and sell in one area, and others would excel in another area. But the area that was a particular need for me was working with studying a client, developing insights, and then translating those insights to solutions. And so we went back to our science base of Clifton Strengths, and we asked the question, out of those strength sets and out of the various consultants that I'd worked with and the outcomes that we delivered to clients, what were the talent themes that would probably be somewhat predictive of an individual doing well across both domains? And our researchers in this area, or the Ph.D.s that do this as part of their neurosciences as their full-time job, came back to me and said, well, John, around innovation and the work that the data that you provided and our foundation understanding of neurosciences and how the brain works, you need two things to go from insight to solutions. You need to have an individual that's kind of a hybrid. They have to have a good set of neurological wiring around being able to analyze things. So if we look at the strength themes, analytical, deliberative, futuristic, ideation, but they also have to be able to have some creative themes around that. And some of these themes cross over. So if you have analytical as one of your strengths, you can hotwire it not just for analyzing things, but being able to also translate that into a creative solution. And so the work that we've done with our consultants is helping them when they're observing a customer experience, a journey map, or data around a new design in the existing baseline state, being able to also leverage their Clifton strength themes and being able to translate that into something that can be implemented and materialized as a marketable solution. So I'll go back to the prior slide. When we're looking at human capital, everyone has strengths, and these strengths fall into different buckets. What's important is for the innovation team, for them to have a recognition of what they bring to the table as an individual, as well as a collective group, and to be able to harness what they bring as a collective group and then harmonize and bring in and leverage areas maybe that are of opportunity to them in the innovation process. And the second slide is around how do you take your current set of strengths as an innate individual and leverage those for both the analysis of being able to study something and come up with a conclusion, and then shift the gears to translate that conclusion into an insight that can then be implemented as a new innovation, a new solution, a new way to change the value proposition. And a clear understanding of how you're wired is a core foundation of that. Now, I know people teach creative workshops, and I'm not saying those are bad things and those can be helpful, but the reality is when we start to really study how the brain works, by the age of 3, you've got between 80 to 100 billion neurons that have formed. And the neuroscientists will debate, is it on the 80 or the 100 million, but that's a pretty good range to work with to start off with. And that's not the key finding. The key finding is that by the time you hit around the age of 16, about half of those synapses from those 80 to 100 billion neurons have formed. Some have gone away and some have become concrete roads by which information flows and how you see life through the prism of your mind. Now, there can still be neuroplasticity that occurs, strongly up to the age of 24. I'm 49 years old, so it becomes harder for someone like me to do that neuromapping. So the best thing that anyone can do is to understand their current neuromaps, the strengths that they innately have and have been formed at a very early age, and leverage those on the innovation roadmap and their contribution to the products, the building, and the contributions that they're making. So in summary, there's no one good Kung Fu. It's more the context of how that Kung Fu is applied. It's the regimen of how that's applied within an organization. It's understanding that despite whatever Kung Fu you use for innovation techniques and methods and tools, that you have to be able to tie it to the value proposition. It should stem from some really deep insights of what's going to change that value proposition. It's being able to create an approach around testing and alternatives so you create the best hybrid design. It's forcing innovators to create learning cycles, and it's helping those innovators, whether it's the individual or the collective team or the broader organization, first understand and appreciate their strengths and leverage those strengths as they drive innovation across the organization. And what I found in terms of strengths with innovation work, some of the people that were the key innovators, they weren't the person that was in charge of culinary or food and beverage or rooms operations. Once we understood their strengths, we found people that were working in purchasing that were pushing carts 8 hours a day between the loading dock and the inventory shelves that had some very innate talents that we were able to bring in and incorporate into innovation teams and create a new level of framing and a new contribution to those teams that we never had when we used the usual suspects, when we just selected people by job title and by not what made them as unique as an individual. So I think we're at the hour, so I'm going to turn it back over to Jose. Hopefully there's been some reinforcement of what you do know, so that's a good thing. Validation is good in many respects, but also equally I hope that I've stimulated some new thought processes in terms of how you view innovation and how it's approached and my lessons from my career within this area. Thank you very much for your time with me tonight, and I'll turn it over to Jose.
John, thank you very much for this amazing presentation. I'm pretty sure that all the participants have gained a lot of what you have said, your tremendous experience in the topic of innovation, and particularly all of these detailed examples that you provided that really we were able to create an image of all of them, and pretty sure that we're going to be applying them in our day-to-day work or future engagements. So just note to the participants, this presentation is going to be available at the ASQ Innovation YouTube channel, and you're going to be able to see the recording within the next few days. We run out of time, so we will not going to be able to make a Q&A session, but thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much, John, again, for this amazing presentation.
Thank you.